Okay, we're going to talk about the assignments for Friday, August 28th that you are doing at home for the first time. So this is your Google Classroom assignment. This is what it looks like. You've got the date and you have a list, basically. Notice that it's telling you you're going to need two things. You're going to need the link to Beowulf that is in Google Classroom so you can read the actual information, the actual book. And then you're going to need the Beowulf study guide, which you also have an assignment for or a link to in Google Classroom. So you're going to need to refer to both of those things. All right, so let's go to the study guide. This is what it looks like. It starts out, study guide for Beowulf, and you're going to be using several different pages of it. So it starts by giving you a chart that lists some of the main characters for the story. We're going to come back to that. We're going to start here with introducing the poem. And it gives you a lot of background information that you can read over and understand some of the things about the author of the poem. I'm just going to paraphrase a lot of this stuff for you, though. One of the most interesting things about the author of Beowulf is that we don't know who he is. This was written back in the Anglo-Saxon time period in England. So it was literally written in the Dark Ages, but we have no idea to this day who wrote the poem. They never identified the poet. They were able to determine several things about this person, though, from his writing. So they were able to determine that it was just one person, they think, who wrote the poem. They were able to determine by the language and the syntax pretty much where he lived and what part of England he lived and what people he belonged to, because every different group had their own dialect and things like that. So they know a few things about him, but they don't know who the person actually was. So that's pretty interesting, but it's also understandable because in this time period, stories would not have been written down. They would have been passed down by word of mouth. So you wouldn't necessarily know who the original author was. You would just know that your grandmother told it to you and that her grandfather told it to her and that his grandfather told it to him and on back through the generations. So by the time this came down through so many generations, they may not have known the original person who told the story. So they didn't have the luxury of writing it down and recording an author in this time period. Most people couldn't read and write in this time period, so that would be why it was told through word of mouth, and that could have been one really good reason why they didn't know who wrote it. But we do know that it is an epic poem and that it is famous enough to have survived to our time period, that we are still reading it today. We're still learning from it today. We're still mainly learning so much about the time period in which it was written from the epic itself. And if you look at this quote right here by Henry Longfellow, it kind of alludes to that. It says, one of the most important remains of Anglo-Saxon literature is the epic poem Beowulf. It comes from a very distant or antiquity, and it's like a piece of ancient armor, rusty and battered and yet strong, because it has survived all this time. So that's what we know about the author and some of the time period influences on the story. Okay, you have a list of characters on the right, and the list is pretty interesting because you have a dragon, you have a monster, you have a king, multiple kings, actually legendary kings, you have warriors, one person's wife, so that kind of gives you an idea about the role of women in the Anglo-Saxon literature. And then, of course, Beowulf is the hero of the poem. And we've been talking about heroes. That's what our last class focus was on. And so that's what we're going to apply to Beowulf as we read his story. Okay, let's back up and take a look at the characters with this chart. So Beowulf belonged to a group of people called the Geats. The story takes place in Denmark and what is now known as Sweden. Well, back then in the Anglo-Saxon time period, it was Geatland for the Geats. And Beowulf is a descendant of the king of the Geats. So he isn't in the direct line right here. He's a nephew, basically, or a great nephew. But he is related to the king, to the royalty. We're going to see how that factors in later in the story. But the story is really not about the Geats, even though that's the people that Beowulf comes from. The story is about these people, the Danes. And so the prologue is really more about the Danes and tracking their lineage and looking at the brave kings that they had throughout the ages than it is about the Geats. We get to meet Beowulf, we get to meet his ancestor later in the story, but not even right at the beginning. So it doesn't even start out with that. It starts out with the Danes. And then down here, kind of to the side, like they weren't quite as important, you have the Swedes, and you find out that the Swedes were basically just in-laws. That's where they came from. They were in-laws of the Danes and the Geats, and so that's why they're just added down here. So those are some things about the characters. I want you to look over this information that we're talking about, but your actual assignments are going to come from starting on page 16. You might recognize this focus activity because we did that as a journal topic. You can glance at this background information. It gives you a little bit more info. But then you're going to start with the vocabulary list. This is going to be our first vocabulary list right here on page 16. So you have this assigned in your Friday assignments, and you're going to write an original sentence for each of these vocabulary words. So take a look at the vocab. You have the word lair, which is a home or resting place. A lot of times we think of lair as with a superhero, a villain's lair, a superhero's lair. You have the word lament, an expression of sorrow or grief. The word loathsome basically means something you hate. Extremely disgusting, repulsive, something you absolutely hate and or cannot stand. To purge, everybody knows what that means from the movie, and it does mean to cleanse or get rid of whatever is unclean. Reparation is the act of giving satisfaction or making amends for a wrong or an injury. So that's basically just apologizing, trying to make up for something wrong that you did. Reprisal is retaliation against an enemy for injuries or losses with the intent of inflicting equal or greater injury. What does that sound like? That's pretty much revenge. And then solace, a relief from sorrow, a comfort, a consolation. So you're going to take each of these vocabulary words and you're going to write one original sentence that you come up with yourself using the word correctly by this definition in the sentence. All right, that's your first assignment. The second assignment is to read the actual prologue of Beowulf, and you need to click on the link that is in Google Classroom that takes you directly to the poem, and you're only going to read the prologue today. So pay attention to what it's labeled and find the prologue. And then the last thing you're going to do is complete this analyzing purpose assignment on page 19 of the study guide. So we're going to skip down to that. We are skipping page 17 and 18. We'll come back to those later, okay? So don't worry about that. But we're going to go down to page 19, and the analyzing purpose is right here. This is what I want you to do. In a few paragraphs, analyze the purpose of the prologue or introduction. How does it set the stage for the action that follows? So you're basically going to answer this. It's like a short answer question. It says a few paragraphs. It's okay if you just write one paragraph, so I'm making that change. But in a paragraph, talk about what you think the purpose of the introduction or the prologue is. Like, why is it even on there? What information does it give you that you really need to understand the rest of the story? So talk about the purpose to the introduction. Talk about how it relates to the story that you're about to read that follows after the prologue. Once you're finished with the vocabulary sentences and you've written your paragraph to respond to the analyzing purpose, that's what you're going to upload and turn into this assignment. Remember that you can do that in one of two ways. You can either type it all up and turn it in to this assignment, or you can write it on notebook paper in pen, take a picture of it, and upload it to this assignment. Either way, please make sure you look at the due date. This is due by Friday night at midnight. And make sure that you read what you need to read in the prologue to answer these questions.